Third-generation farmer Henry Wilson shared his entire autumn harvest with a homeless veteran, sheltering in his barn during a devastating drought, sacrificing his last chance to save his foreclosed family land. 3 days later, with only hours left before eviction, Henry discovered a convoy of military vehicles approaching his property, led by a 4-star general who revealed a connection to the veteran that would transform Henry's modest farm into something he never could have imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Henry Wilson's weathered hands moved with practiced precision across his ancient tractor's engine, his arthritic fingers finding each problem spot through memory rather than sight. At 72, Henry's face carried the permanent tan and deep creases of a man who had spent 7 decades under the open Kansas sky. His once strong frame remained surprisingly sturdy, despite the years, lean from honest work rather than deliberate exercise, though he moved more slowly than he once had. The relentless August sun beat down on his shoulders as he worked, but Henry barely noticed the heat. A lifetime in the drought-prone plains of central Kansas had made him impervious to all but the most extreme weather. What he couldn't ignore was the cloudless sky that had persisted for nearly 3 months now, a beautiful blue menace that threatened everything he had left. Just a little more time, he murmured, to the 1976 International Harvester that had belonged to his father. That's all I'm asking. From the nearby barn, Henry's black and white border collie, Scout, barked twice before racing toward the dusty driveway, tail wagging frantically. A pickup truck approached, its familiar rattle announcing Henry's younger sister Margaret before she came into view. Henry wiped his greasy hands on a rag that had once been a kitchen towel and straightened, wincing as his knees cracked in protest. 6 decades of working the land had left their mark, though he'd never admit it to anyone, least of all Margaret, who'd left farm life decades ago for a teaching career in Wichita, nearly 100 miles away. "Should have known I'd find you fixing something," Margaret called as she climbed from her truck. At 68, Margaret carried the Wilson features, bright blue eyes and a determined chin, but her hands were smooth, her shoulders unburdened by the weight of a struggling family legacy. "Tractor doesn't fix itself," Henry replied with a gentle smile. Despite the occasional envy he felt for his sister's more comfortable life, there was no resentment between them. Margaret had offered numerous times to help financially, but Henry's pride had always prevented him from accepting. The siblings walked toward the 2-story farmhouse that had been in the Wilson family since 1923. Its white paint had faded to a soft gray, and the wraparound porch sagged slightly on the eastern corner, but to Henry it was still the most beautiful building in Cottonwood County. "Coffee's still hot," Henry said as they entered the kitchen, where the ancient ceiling fan struggled to move the stifling air. The house was modest but immaculately maintained inside, with the original oak floors his grandfather had installed, and the sturdy maple table around which 3 generations of Wilsons had shared meals. Margaret settled at the table while Henry poured 2 mugs of coffee that had been brewing since dawn. On the kitchen wall hung family photographs spanning decades, Henry and Margaret as children helping their father bring in hay, their mother proudly displaying prize-winning preserves at the county fair, their grandparents standing beside the first tractor the family ever owned. Most prominently displayed was a faded photograph of Henry's grandparents, Thomas and Elizabeth Wilson, standing in front of the newly built farmhouse in 1923, their expressions solemn, but their eyes filled with hope. "How's Richard?" Henry asked, referring to Margaret's husband as he set the mugs down. "Good, busy with his volunteer work at the Veterans Center. You know he can't sit still, even in retirement." Margaret wrapped her hands around the warm mug despite the heat of the day. "The kids were asking about you. Emily's boy just turned 7. They thought maybe you'd come for his birthday party next weekend. Nothing fancy, just family." Henry nodded, though they both knew he rarely left the farm these days. There was always too much to do, too many repairs, too little help. After his wife Sarah had passed 5 years ago, after 43 years of marriage, Henry had retreated further into his work, finding solace in the rhythm of seasons and the predictability of crops, if not of rainfall. "You didn't drive all this way to invite me to a birthday party," Henry said finally. Margaret had that look, concerned, cautious, that Henry had come to recognize over the years. Margaret sighed. "Richard saw Mr. Harmon from First Kansas Bank in town yesterday. There's talk about your mortgage." Henry's jaw tightened. He'd hoped to have more time before word spread. Cottonwood was small, just over 3,000 people, and news traveled fast, especially bad news about one of the county's oldest farming families. "My business with the bank is private," Henry said more sharply than he'd intended. "Not in Cottonwood," Margaret countered. "Henry, if you're in trouble again, I'm handling it." Henry stood and moved to the window overlooking his fields. The corn he'd planted in May stood stunted and yellow in the parched soil, casualties of the worst drought to hit Kansas in 30 years. His wheat had failed entirely, and the vegetable garden that normally supplied his own needs and provided extra income at the farmer's market had withered weeks ago, despite his careful rationing of well water. The truth Henry couldn't bring himself to share was that Wilson Farm was 4 months behind on its mortgage. The bank had granted him extensions based on the projected yield of his remaining crops, but their patience was wearing thin. If he couldn't deliver a harvest substantial enough to make a significant payment by the end of the month, First Kansas Bank would begin foreclosure proceedings, ending nearly a century of Wilson's stewardship of this land. Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You know," Margaret said carefully, "the offer still stands. Richard and I have that money from selling the cottage. We could—" "No," Henry cut her off firmly. "I told you before, I'm not taking your retirement savings. This farm has been in our family for 3 generations. It's my responsibility." Margaret ran a hand through her silver hair in frustration, a gesture so like their mother that Henry had to look away. "It's not just your responsibility, Henry. It's your prison. When's the last time you even left the county, took a day off? The farm was never meant to be a life sentence." Henry remained silent. How could he explain to Margaret that the farm wasn't a prison but his purpose? That despite the hardships, the droughts, the equipment breakdowns, the rising costs and falling crop prices, he still felt the same connection to this land that had sustained their family through the Great Depression, through wars and personal tragedies. The Wilson men endure. That's what their grandfather had said countless times during Henry's childhood. His words had carried Henry through Sarah's long illness, through the years of solitude that followed, through the crop failures and the lonely nights when the enormity of preserving the family legacy threatened to crush him. "I've still got the vegetable stand by the highway," Henry said finally, changing the subject. "People still stop, drought or no drought. If I can sell what's left of the tomatoes and melons, plus what's in the root cellar from spring, I should have enough to make a partial payment. Buy some time until the rains come." Margaret looked skeptical, but didn't press further. She knew her brother well enough to recognize when a subject was closed. Instead, she reached into her purse and withdrew a small wrapped package. "Early birthday present," she said, pushing it across the table. Richard insisted. Henry unwrapped it carefully to find a framed photograph, a newly restored version of the oldest family photo they possessed, showing their grandfather standing proudly on the land he had just purchased in 1920, 3 years before the house was built. Richard found someone online who specializes in restoring old photographs, Margaret explained. "He thought you might like to have it fixed up." Henry ran his finger along the frame, emotion tightening his throat. In the photo, Thomas Wilson stood tall despite his visible exhaustion, his eyes reflecting the same determination Henry saw in the mirror each morning. "Thank him for me," Henry managed, setting the photograph carefully on the table beside the family Bible that contained records of births, deaths, and harvests stretching back a century. They talked for another hour about Margaret's grandchildren, about the county's declining population as more young people left for cities, about the weather forecast that stubbornly refused to predict rain in the coming week. What remained unspoken was their shared fear that Henry might be the last Wilson to farm this land, that a legacy spanning a century might end on his watch. As Margaret prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "Promise me something, Henry. If things get worse, you'll call before it's too late. Pride won't save the farm." Henry nodded, though they both knew it was a promise he might not keep. After his sister's truck disappeared down the long driveway, Henry returned to his work on the tractor, his movements more determined than before. Above him, the cloudless sky stretched endlessly, offering no relief for his parched fields or his mounting worries. Scout settled nearby, watching his master with unwavering loyalty as the afternoon heat began to moderate slightly. In the shadow of the barn, Henry worked by the beam of a single worklight, his face illuminated in the growing dusk, his mind fixed on the few remaining crops that represented his last hope. The next morning dawned clear and punishingly hot, the kind of August day that seemed to shimmer above the Kansas plains. Henry rose before the sun, as he had every day since childhood, moving through his morning routine with practiced efficiency. Coffee brewing, scout fed, weather report checked, still no rain in sight, and a hearty breakfast of eggs from his, remaining chickens and toast to fuel the day's labor. Henry's kitchen radio crackled with the local station's morning farm report as he pulled on his worn work boots. Farmers across Cottonwood County should prepare for continued extreme drought conditions. The National Weather Service has extended the drought warning for another 3 weeks, with temperatures expected to remain 10 to 15 degrees above normal for this time of year. Water conservation measures remain in effect, and rural residents are reminded to check on elderly neighbors during this period of excessive heat. Henry frowned, moving to the kitchen window. The merciless sun already promised another scorching day, beating down on fields that hadn't seen significant rainfall since May. A drought of this magnitude threatened what little remained of his crops, the few rows of tomatoes and melons he'd managed to keep alive through careful hand-watering from his increasingly strained well. He grabbed his worn leather account book from the kitchen drawer, the latest in a series that stretched back to his grandfather's time. Each Wilson man had kept meticulous records of plantings, harvests, weather patterns, and costs. Henry flipped through his most recent calculations, studying the numbers that would determine his future. His remaining crops, even if they survived the drought, would bring in less than a quarter of what he needed to satisfy the bank. The small pension from Sarah's years as a school secretary helped with daily expenses, but wouldn't make a dent in the mortgage arrears. His savings had been depleted during Sarah's illness, despite their insurance. The margins were razor-thin, leaving no room for error or bad luck, both of which had been in abundant supply these past few years. 3 consecutive seasons of below-average rainfall had depleted his financial reserves. The unexpected breakdown of his irrigation pump last spring had forced him to water by hand, limiting what he could save. And all the while, the bank's patience had worn thinner with each late payment and request for extension. Henry closed the account book with a decisive snap. If the drought continued, he needed to salvage whatever crops he could and find a way to stretch his meager income until something changed. The forecast offered no hope of rain, but perhaps he could sell some of his less essential equipment to raise quick cash. The thought of parting with tools that had been on the farm for generations pained him, but losing the land itself would be infinitely worse. Outside, Scout bounded ahead of Henry as they made their way toward the small patch of surviving crops near the house where Henry had focused his water rations. The morning sun warmed Henry's face as he walked, the familiar ache in his knees a constant companion these days. "Looking good, aren't you?" he murmured, kneeling with effort to examine a struggling tomato plant, its fruit smaller than usual, but still developing despite the harsh conditions. Wilsons are stubborn, and so are Wilson tomatoes. His cell phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. Few people called this early, and the screen showed James Harmon's name from First Kansas Bank. Henry's stomach tightened. When the bank called at 7:30 in the morning, it was rarely good news. "Mr. Harmon," he answered, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Mr. Wilson." The tone was professionally cordial, but with an unmistakable edge of finality. "I've just come from our morning loan committee meeting. I wanted to call you personally before the official notice is sent." Henry stopped walking, his free hand instinctively gripping the fence post beside him. "What notice?" "I'm sorry, Henry." For the first time in their long acquaintance, James used his first name, a shift that signaled the conversation had moved beyond business. "The committee has voted unanimously to deny any further extensions. Your final payment is due August 31st, as stipulated in our last agreement. If payment isn't received in full by close of business that day, foreclosure proceedings will begin September the 1st. The weathered wood splintered slightly in Henry's grip. "James, you know my situation. If we could just get some rain. I have crops that might still—" "It's out of my hands," he interrupted gently. "The decision is final. I truly am sorry. Your family has been with our bank since my grandfather's time." After the call ended, Henry stood motionless in the middle of his garden, the phone still clutched in his hand. Around him, the struggling. Plants he'd nursed through months of drought seemed to wilt further under the weight of the news. Scout circled back, sensing Henry's distress, and pressed against his leg with a soft whine. "It's okay, boy," Henry said automatically, though nothing was okay at all. The reality he'd been fighting finally crashed over him in waves he could no longer hold back. Unless a miracle occurred in less than 3 weeks, Wilson Farm would belong to First Kansas Bank. 3 generations of history, struggle, triumph, and tradition would end with him. Henry Wilson would be the last of his name to work this land. He looked around at the fields his family had tended for nearly a century, where his father had taught him to drive a tractor at age 10, where his grandfather had weathered the dust. Bowl, by developing innovative dry farming techniques, where he and Sarah had raised their son Thomas, who had chosen a military career over farming and now lived in Germany with his family. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though to whom, his ancestors, the land itself, or his own future, he couldn't say. By mid-afternoon, Henry had formulated a desperate plan. He would harvest whatever vegetables remained viable and take them not just to his roadside stand, but directly to the farmers' markets in 3 neighboring towns. It wouldn't be enough to save the farm, but it might provide leverage for one final appeal to the bank. He spent hours gathering his remaining produce, carefully selecting each tomato, melon, and cucumber that might fetch even a modest price. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the parched landscape, Henry paused his work at the sound of Scout's urgent barking. Not his usual friendly greeting, but a sharper, more cautious alert. Henry straightened, shading his eyes against the setting sun, and peered toward the old barn at the far edge of his property, where Scout stood at attention, his posture rigid with awareness, moving with as much haste as his aching knees would allow. Henry crossed the dusty yard, a sense of unease growing with each step. As he approached the barn, Scout's barking subsided to a low growl. The ancient structure had been built by his grandfather and had weathered countless storms, but Henry used it only for storage now, keeping his tractor and most of his equipment in the newer outbuilding closer to the house. "Hello?" Henry called, pushing open the weathered door, which creaked in protest. "Anyone there?" For a moment, the dim interior revealed nothing unusual, just the expected jumble of old equipment, stored hay, and accumulated farm miscellany. Then a slight movement in the far corner caught his eye. A man sat huddled against the wall, partially concealed behind an old horse stall. He was thin to the point of gauntness, his clothes worn and dusty, his face weathered beyond his years, though Henry guessed him to be in his mid-40s. What struck Henry most, however, was the look in the man's eyes, alert but exhausted, cautious but not threatening. "Didn't mean to trespass," the man said, his voice hoarse as if unused to speaking. "Just needed shelter from the sun for a bit. I'll move on." He began to gather a shabby backpack and a bedroll that had clearly seen better days. As he stood, Henry noticed he favored his right leg, and the movement revealed a military-style tattoo partially visible on his forearm. "You're a veteran," Henry said. It wasn't a question. The man paused, then nodded once. "Afghanistan. 2 tours. Iraq. For 1. Henry glanced at Scout, who had ceased growling and now watched the stranger with simple curiosity. The dog had always been an excellent judge of character. "When did you last eat?" Henry asked, noticing the hollow look of the man's cheeks. The stranger seemed taken aback by the question. "Had some crackers yesterday," he admitted after a moment. Henry nodded, decision made. "I've got stew on the stove, and it's supposed to be over 100 degrees tomorrow. No sense walking in that." The man hesitated, conflict evident on his face. "Don't need charity." "Not offering charity," Henry replied simply. "Offering dinner and a roof to a fellow American who served his country. My son's military too. Army. stationed in Germany. Something in the stranger's posture relaxed slightly at the mention of Henry's son. "Name's Michael. Michael Reeves," he said finally. "Henry Wilson," Henry replied, extending his hand. After a moment's pause, Michael shook it. "The house is this way. You can clean up if you want. Bathroom's got a shower." As they walked toward the farmhouse, Henry felt a curious lightening of his spirit. Despite the day's devastating news from the bank, there was something about taking action, about helping someone else when he himself was in dire straits, that felt right, that connected him to something larger than his own troubles. Inside, while Michael showered, Henry added more vegetables to the stew he'd started earlier and set the old oak table in the kitchen. Scout settled on his rug by the refrigerator, apparently having decided the visitor posed no threat. When Michael emerged, his face was clean-shaven and his hair damp, though his clothes remained worn and faded. He moved with the careful precision of someone managing chronic pain. "Afghanistan?" Henry asked, gesturing to Michael's leg as he ladled stew into bowls. Michael nodded, taking the seat Henry indicated. "IED in 2010 took out our transport. Lost 2 friends and gained a collection of shrapnel. Most of it's still in there." They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, Michael clearly savoring each spoonful of the hearty stew as if it might be his last meal for some time, which, Henry reflected, might well have been the case had Scout not discovered him. "This farm been in your family long?" Michael asked eventually, glancing at the photographs on the wall. "Since 1923, Henry replied. "My grandfather bought it after serving in World War I. Said farming was the only thing that made sense after. What he'd seen over there." Michael nodded as if this made perfect sense to him. Lots of guys feel that way. Something about growing things instead of destroying them. The simple observation struck Henry with unexpected force. That was exactly what his grandfather had written in his journal, entries Henry had read and reread over the years. The notion that this stranger understood something so fundamental about the Wilson family connection to the land created an immediate bond between them. As the evening progressed, Henry learned that Michael had been homeless for nearly 3 years, ever since his VA benefits had been caught up in bureaucratic complications he didn't fully understand. He'd been a sergeant in the Army Rangers, had received a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star, and had worked as a mechanic after his discharge until the pain from his injuries and the PTSD had made consistent employment impossible. "Been making my way east," Michael explained. "Got a buddy from my unit in Cincinnati who said he might have work at his brother's garage. Jobs where you can sit when the leg gets bad." "How far have you come?" Henry asked. "Started in Colorado. Been on the road about 2 months." Henry calculated the distance. "That's over 400 miles. Walking?" Michael nodded. "Some rides here and there. Buses, when I can afford them." The matter-of-fact way he described what must have been an arduous journey impressed Henry deeply. Here was a man who had served his country with distinction, who had suffered physical and mental wounds for that service, now reduced to walking across states in the hope of finding work that might accommodate his disabilities. When it came time for bed, Henry showed Michael to the spare room, the one that had been Thomas's growing up and was now used primarily when Margaret's grandchildren visited. "Why are you doing this?" Michael asked bluntly as Henry provided him with a clean towel and a pair of Thomas's old pajamas kept in the dresser. "You don't know me. Could be dangerous." Henry considered the question seriously. My grandfather came back from the Great War to find that the country he'd fought for didn't have much use for him afterward. A stranger gave him a chance, hired him to work, which let him save enough to buy this land. Said he was repaying a debt to all the boys who served. He gestured to the room around them. I'm just paying it forward. After Michael had settled in for the night, Henry sat at the kitchen table with his account book open before him. The unforgiving numbers hadn't changed, but somehow they seemed less overwhelming tonight. Whatever happened with the bank, with the farm, with his future, he had done something his grandfather and father would have approved of. He had honored their memory not just by working their land, but by extending the same kindness to a stranger that had once been extended to his own family. As Henry prepared for bed, he noticed the calendar on the wall where August 31st was circled in red, the bank's final deadline. The old despair threatened to return, but he pushed it aside. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. For tonight, he had made a difference in one person's life, and that was enough. Outside, the night sky was brilliant with stars, the kind of dazzling display only visible far from city lights. Henry paused at his bedroom window, gazing up at the timeless constellations that had watched over generations of Wilsons. There was comfort in that continuity, in being part of something that transcended his individual struggles. As he drifted towards sleep, Henry found himself thinking not of foreclosure notices or failed crops, but of the unexpected guest sleeping down the hall. A man who, despite his circumstances, still possessed the dignity and resilience that Henry had always associated with the best of America. Whether the farm survived or not, tonight Henry had been true to the values that had sustained his family for nearly a century on this land. Whatever came next, he would face it with the same quiet integrity. The next morning dawned clear and punishingly hot, the kind of August day that seemed to shimmer above the Kansas plains. Henry rose before the sun, as he had every day since childhood, moving through his morning routine with practiced efficiency. Coffee brewing, scout fed, weather report checked, still no rain in sight, and a hearty breakfast of eggs from his remaining chickens and toast to fuel the day's labor. Henry's kitchen radio crackled with the local station's morning farm report as he pulled on his worn work boots. Farmers across Cottonwood County should prepare for continued extreme drought conditions. The National Weather Service has extended the drought warning for another 3 weeks, with temperatures expected to remain 10 to 15 degrees above normal for this time of year. Water conservation measures remain in effect, and rural residents are reminded to check on elderly neighbors during this period of excessive heat. Henry frowned, moving to the kitchen window. The merciless sun already promised another scorching day, beating down on fields that hadn't seen significant rainfall since May. A drought of this magnitude threatened what little remained of his crops, the few rows of tomatoes and melons he'd managed to keep alive through careful hand-watering from his increasingly strained well. He grabbed his worn leather account book from the kitchen drawer, the latest in a series that stretched back to his grandfather's time. Each Wilson man had kept meticulous records of plantings, harvests, weather patterns, and costs. Henry flipped to his most recent calculations, studying the numbers that would determine his future. His remaining crops, even if they survived the drought, would bring in less than a quarter of what he needed to satisfy the bank. The small pension from Sarah's years as a school secretary helped with daily expenses, but wouldn't make a dent in the mortgage arrears. His savings had been depleted during Sarah's illness, despite their insurance. The margins were razor thin, leaving no room for error or bad luck, both of which had been in abundant supply these past few years. 3 consecutive seasons of below-average rainfall had depleted his financial reserves. The unexpected breakdown of his irrigation pump last spring had forced him to water by hand, limiting what he could save. And all the while, the bank's patience had worn thinner with each late payment and request for extension. Henry closed the account book with a decisive snap. If the drought continued, he needed to salvage whatever crops he could and find a way to stretch his meager income until something changed. The forecast offered no hope of rain, but perhaps he could sell some of his less essential equipment to raise quick cash. The thought of parting with tools that had been on the farm for generations pained him, but losing the land itself would be infinitely worse. Outside, Scout bounded ahead of Henry as they made their way toward the small patch of surviving crops near the house where Henry had focused his water rations. The morning sun warmed Henry's face as he walked, the familiar ache in his knees a constant companion these days. "Looking good, aren't you?" he murmured, kneeling with effort to examine a struggling tomato plant, its fruit smaller than usual, but still developing despite the harsh conditions. Wilsons are stubborn, and so are Wilson tomatoes. His cell phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. Few people called this early, and the screen showed James Harmon's name from First Kansas Bank. Henry's stomach tightened. When the bank called at 7:30 in the morning, it was rarely good news. "Mr. Harmon," he answered, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Mr. Wilson." The tone was professionally cordial, but with an unmistakable edge of finality. "I've just come from our morning loan committee meeting. I wanted to call you personally before the official notice is sent." Henry stopped walking, his free hand instinctively gripping the fence post beside him. "What notice?" "I'm sorry." "Henry?" For the first time in their long acquaintance, James used his first name, a shift that signaled the conversation had moved beyond business. "The committee has voted unanimously to deny any further extensions. Your final payment is due August 31st, as stipulated in our last agreement. If payment isn't received in full by close of business that day, foreclosure proceedings will begin September 1st. The weathered wood splintered slightly in Henry's grip. "James, you know my situation. If we could just get some rain, I have crops that might still—" "It's out of my hands," he interrupted gently. "The decision is final. I truly am sorry. Your family has been with our bank since my grandfather's time." After the call ended, Henry stood motionless in the middle of his garden, the phone still clutched in his hand. Around him, the struggling plants he'd nursed through months of drought seemed to wilt further under the weight of the news. Scout circled back, sensing Henry's distress, and pressed against his leg with a soft whine. "It's okay, boy," Henry said automatically, though nothing was okay at all. The reality he'd been fighting finally crashed over him in waves he could no longer hold back. Unless a miracle occurred in less than 3 weeks, Wilson Farm would belong to First Kansas Bank. 3 generations of history, struggle, triumph, and tradition would end with him. Henry Wilson would be the last of his name to work this land. He looked around at the fields his family had tended for nearly a century, where his father had taught him to drive a tractor at age 10, where his grandfather had weathered the dust. whole by developing innovative dry farming techniques, where he and Sarah had raised their son Thomas, who had chosen a military career over farming and now lived in Germany with his family. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though to whom, his ancestors, the land itself, or his own future, he couldn't say. By mid-afternoon, Henry had formulated a desperate plan. He would harvest whatever vegetables remained viable and take them not just to his roadside stand, but directly to the farmers' markets in 3 neighboring towns. It wouldn't be enough to save the farm, but it might provide leverage for one final appeal to the bank. He spent hours gathering his remaining produce, carefully selecting each tomato, melon and cucumber that might fetch even a modest price. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the parched landscape, Henry paused his work at the sound of Scout's urgent barking, not his usual friendly greeting, but a sharper, more cautious alert. Henry straightened, shading his eyes against the setting sun, and peered toward the old barn at the far edge of his property where Scout stood at attention, his posture rigid with awareness. Moving with as much haste as his aching knees would allow, Henry crossed the dusty yard, a sense of unease growing with each step. As he approached the barn, Scout's barking subsided to a low growl. The ancient structure had been built by his grandfather and had weathered countless storms, but Henry used it only for storage now, keeping his tractor and most of his equipment in the newer outbuilding closer to the house. "Hello?" Henry called, pushing open the weathered door, which creaked in protest. "Anyone there?" For a moment, the dim interior revealed nothing unusual, just the expected jumble of old equipment, stored hay, and accumulated farm miscellany. Then a slight movement in the far corner caught his eye. A man sat huddled against the wall, partially concealed behind an old horse stall. He was thin to the point of gauntness, his clothes worn and dusty, his face weathered beyond his years, though Henry guessed him to be in his mid-40s. What struck Henry most, however, was the look in the man's eyes, alert but exhausted, cautious but not threatening. "Didn't mean to trespass," the man said, his voice hoarse as if unused to speaking. "Just needed shelter from the sun for a bit. I'll move on." He began to gather a shabby backpack and a bedroll that had clearly seen better days. As he stood, Henry noticed he favored his right leg, and the movement revealed a military-style tattoo partially visible on his forearm. "You're a veteran," Henry said. It wasn't a question. The man paused, then nodded once. "Afghanistan. 2 tours. Iraq for 1. Henry glanced at Scout, who had ceased growling and now watched the stranger with simple curiosity. The dog had always been an excellent judge of character. "When did you last eat?" Henry asked, noticing the hollow look of the man's cheeks. The stranger seemed taken aback by the question. "Had some crackers yesterday," he admitted after a moment. Henry nodded, decision made. "I've got stew on the stove. And it's supposed to be over 100 degrees tomorrow. No sense walking in that." The man hesitated, conflict evident on his face. "Don't need charity." "Not offering charity," Henry replied simply. "Offering dinner and a roof to a fellow American who served his country, my son's military too, army, stationed in Germany." Something in the stranger's posture relaxed slightly at the mention of Henry's son. "Name's Michael. Michael Reeves," he said finally. "Henry Wilson," Henry replied, extending his hand. After a moment's pause, Michael shook it. "The house is this way. You can clean up if you want. Bathroom's got a shower." As they walked toward the farmhouse, Henry felt a curious lightening of his spirit despite the day's devastating news from the bank. There was something about taking action, about helping someone else when he himself was in dire straits, that felt right, that connected him to something larger than his own troubles. Inside, while Michael showered, Henry added more vegetables to the stew he'd started earlier and set the old oak table in the kitchen. Scout settled on his rug by the refrigerator, apparently having decided the visitor posed no threat. When Michael emerged, his face was clean-shaven and his hair damp, though his clothes remained worn and faded. He moved with the careful precision of someone managing chronic pain. "Afghanistan?" Henry asked, gesturing to Michael's leg as he ladled stew into bowls. Michael nodded, taking the seat Henry indicated. "IED in 2010. Took out our transport. Lost 2 friends and gained a collection of shrapnel, most of it still in there." They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, Michael clearly savouring each spoonful of the hearty stew, as if it might be his last meal for some time, which, Henry reflected, might well have been the case had Scout not discovered him. "This farm been in your family long?" Michael asked eventually, glancing at the photographs on the wall. "Since 1923, Henry replied. "My grandfather bought it after serving in World War I. Said farming was the only thing that made sense after what he'd seen over there." Michael nodded as if this made perfect sense to him. Lots of guys feel that way, something about growing things instead of destroying them. The simple observation struck Henry with unexpected force. That was exactly what his grandfather had written in his journal, entries Henry had read and reread over the years. The notion that this stranger understood something so fundamental about the Wilson family connection to the land created an immediate bond between them. As the evening progressed, Henry learned that Michael had been homeless for nearly 3 years. Ever since his VA benefits had been caught up in bureaucratic complications he didn't fully understand. He'd been a sergeant in the Army Rangers, had received a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star, and had worked as a mechanic after his discharge until the pain from his injuries and the PTSD had made consistent employment impossible. "Been making my way east," Michael explained. "Got a buddy from my unit in Cincinnati who said he might have work at his brother's garage. Jobs where you can sit when the leg gets bad." "How far have you come?" Henry asked. "Started in Colorado. Been on the road about 2 months." Henry calculated the distance. "That's over 400 miles. "Walking?" Michael nodded. "Some rides here and there. Buses when I can afford them." The matter-of-fact way he described what must have been an arduous journey impressed Henry deeply. Here was a man who had served his country with distinction, who had suffered physical and mental wounds for that service, now reduced to walking across states in the hope of finding work that might accommodate his disabilities. When it came time for bed, Henry showed Michael to the spare room, the one that had been Thomas's growing up and was now used primarily when Margaret's grandchildren visited. "Why are you doing this?" Michael asked bluntly, as Henry provided him with a clean towel and a pair of Thomas's old pajamas kept in the dresser. "You don't know me. Could be dangerous." Henry considered the question seriously. "My grandfather came back from the Great War to find that the country he'd fought for didn't have much use for him afterward. A stranger gave him a chance, hired him to work, which let him save enough to buy this land, said he was repaying a debt to all the boys who served." He gestured to the room around them. "I'm just paying it forward." After Michael had settled in for the night, Henry sat at the kitchen table with his account book open before him. The unforgiving numbers hadn't changed, but somehow they seemed less overwhelming tonight. Whatever happened with the bank, with the farm, with his future, He had done something his grandfather and father would have approved of. He had honored their memory not just by working their land, but by extending the same kindness to a stranger that had once been extended to his own family. As Henry prepared for bed, he noticed the calendar on the wall where August 31st was circled in red, the bank's final deadline. The old despair threatened to return, but he pushed it aside. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. For tonight, he had made a difference in one person's life, and that was enough. Outside, the night sky was brilliant with stars, the kind of dazzling display only visible far from city lights. Henry paused at his bedroom window, gazing up at the timeless constellations that had watched over generations of Wilsons. There was comfort in that continuity, in being part of something that transcended his individual struggles. As he drifted towards sleep, Henry found himself thinking not of foreclosure notices or failed crops, but of the unexpected guest sleeping down the hall. A man who, despite his circumstances, still possessed the dignity and resilience that Henry had always associated with the best of America. Whether the farm survived or not, tonight Henry had been true to the values that had sustained his family for nearly a century on this land. Whatever came next, he would face it with the same quiet integrity. The next morning broke just as relentlessly hot as the previous days, the drought's grip showing no sign of easing. Henry rose at his usual early hour to find Michael already awake. Sitting on the porch steps, watching the sunrise, a mug of coffee cradled in his hands. "Hope you don't mind," Michael said, gesturing with the mug. "Found the coffee? Thought I'd make myself useful." "Not at all," Henry replied, settling beside him with his own cup. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching as the eastern sky transitioned from pearl grey to pink to gold, the sun rising like a molten coin above the horizon. "Going to be another scorcher," Henry observed, feeling the days. "Heat already beginning to build. Supposed to hit 103 by afternoon," Michael nodded. "Reminds me of Afghanistan. Dry heat like this. Even the shade doesn't help much. Everything feels like it's baking from the inside out." The comparison struck Henry as apt. Kansas in drought did have something in common with a desert landscape, the same relentless sun, the same parched earth cracked and thirsting for relief. "Got work to do in town today," Henry said, finishing his coffee. "Need to talk to the bank, see if there's anything to be done about this foreclosure notice. You're welcome to stay here. Rest up." Michael's expression shifted slightly. "Rather, earn my keep if you don't mind. Not used to sitting idle. I noticed your fence line on the north side has some posts that need reinforcing. Could take care of that while you're gone." Henry hesitated. The offer was tempting. The fence had indeed been on his repair list for months, but more pressing matters had repeatedly pushed it aside. Still, asking a man in Michael's condition to work in the brutal August heat seemed exploitative. Reading his thoughts, Michael added, "I can pace myself. Done plenty of work in worse conditions. Besides, being useful, it helps." With the thoughts, Henry understood immediately. The thoughts that haunted many veterans needed no further explanation. Purposeful physical labor had always been Henry's own remedy for dark moods and troubled memories. Why wouldn't it serve the same purpose for Michael? "Appreciate it," Henry said simply. "Tools are in the shed. Take breaks when you need to. Plenty of water in the fridge." An hour later, Henry drove his battered pickup toward Cottonwood, his mind focused on the difficult conversation ahead with James Harmon at First Kansas Bank. He had prepared his arguments carefully, his family's century-long history with the bank, the possibility of rain ending the drought, the modest income from his vegetable sales at the farmers' markets. None of these points would likely sway the bank's decision, but Henry felt compelled to make the effort nonetheless. The small town of Cottonwood appeared much as it always had, though Henry noted more empty storefronts than on his last visit. Rural America's slow decline was evident even here, in a community that had once been thriving. The bank occupied a brick building on the main street, its facade freshly painted despite the economic challenges facing the region. Henry. James Harmon greeted him with the awkward formality of someone delivering bad news to an old acquaintance. "I expected you might come in. Let's talk in my office." The bank manager's office was modest but comfortable, with framed photographs of local landmarks and agricultural scenes adorning the walls. Henry recognized one, an aerial shot of Wilson Farm taken perhaps 20 years earlier, when his fields had been lush with wheat and corn. "I'm sorry about the committee's decision," James began once they were seated. "I argued for another extension, but with the drought showing no signs of breaking, and the farm's income projections being what they are." "I understand the economics," Henry acknowledged, "but this farm has weathered worse than this drought. My grandfather survived the Dust Bowl on this land. My father made it through the farm crisis of the 80s, given a little more time." James shook his head gently. "Banking has changed, Henry. Local decision-making isn't what it once was. The committee has to answer to regional management, who answer to the national board. Agriculture loans are being scrutinized more carefully than ever, especially in areas experiencing climate stress. The clinical assessment stung, reducing generations of Wilson perseverance to a risk management calculation." But Henry recognized the truth in James's words. The world had changed, and perhaps the era of family farms like his truly was drawing to a close. "What options do I have?" Henry asked finally, "besides full payment by the 31st, which we both know isn't possible." James leaned forward, his expression shifting to something more personal, less corporate. "There are a few possibilities, none ideal. You could seek outside investment, bring in a partner with capital, or consider selling a portion of the land to settle the debt and keep a smaller, more manageable acreage." The suggestions, though practical, felt like surrendering pieces of his heritage, compromising the integrity of what 3 generations of Wilsons had built. Henry had always envisioned passing the farm intact to future generations, not a fragmented version of what had once been. "I'll consider it," Henry said, though they both knew he wouldn't. His pride wouldn't allow for half measures or partial solutions. Either the farm would continue as it had been, or it would pass into other hands entirely. As Henry rose to leave, James handed him a business card. "There's a new agricultural investment group looking for established farms in this region. Sustainable farming focus, I believe. Might be worth a call, at least." Henry pocketed the card with a nod of thanks, though he had little intention of pursuing the lead. Outside, the midday heat hit him like a physical force as he stepped onto the sidewalk. He paused, leaning against his truck, suddenly overwhelmed by the futility of his situation. The farm he had devoted his life to, the land that had shaped his identity and purpose, would soon belong to strangers, transformed perhaps into another industrial agriculture operation where profit margins mattered more than legacy or stewardship. A tap on his shoulder startled him from his grim thoughts. Henry turned to find Patricia Garcia, who owned the cafe down the street and had been a classmate of his in high school. "You look like you could use some coffee and air conditioning," she said, concern evident in her expression. "On the house. Just baked a fresh apple pie, too." The simple kindness nearly undid him. Henry followed Patricia to her cafe, grateful for the respite from both the heat and his troubled thoughts. Inside, the small restaurant was cool and inviting, with checkered tablecloths and the comforting aroma of home cooking. "Been hearing things," Patricia said, as she served him coffee and a generous slice of pie. "About the farm. Bank troubles?" In a small town like Cottonwood, there were few secrets. Henry nodded, not bothering to deny what was clearly common knowledge. "Got until the end of the month to make a payment that's about as likely as snow in August." Patricia settled across from him, her expression sympathetic but not pitying. "My dad lost his farm in the 80s, nearly broke him, not just financially but in spirit. Took him years to find his footing again." She paused, studying Henry thoughtfully. "But the thing is, he did find it. Different life than he'd planned, but not without purpose or meaning." Henry appreciated the attempt at comfort, though the prospect of finding his footing away from Wilson Farm seemed abstract to the point of impossibility. The farm wasn't just where he lived or worked. It was who he was, the physical manifestation of his identity and values. "Anyway," Patricia continued, rising as another customer entered, "wanted you to know folks around here are thinking of you. Whatever happens, you're not alone in this." The drive back to the farm was a contemplative one, Henry's mind shifting between practical considerations, what to sell, what to keep, where to live after the foreclosure, and deeper reflections on identity and purpose. Who was Henry Wilson without Wilson Farm? What would define his days, his sense of self, his connection to the past and future? As he turned onto the long driveway leading to the farmhouse, Henry was surprised to see significant progress on the fence line Michael had offered to repair. Despite the brutal heat, the veteran had reinforced several posts and tightened the sagging wire, transforming a neglected boundary into something secure and proper. Michael himself was nowhere in sight, presumably taking a break from the midday sun, as Henry had advised. Scout greeted Henry enthusiastically, circling the truck with joyful barks as he parked. Inside, Henry found Michael at the kitchen table, nursing a glass of water and studying one of the old family photo albums that had been kept on the bookshelf. "Hope you don't mind," Michael said, closing the album as Henry entered. "Got curious about the farm's history after our conversation last night." "Not at all," Henry assured him, pouring his own glass of water. "Those albums are meant to be seen. Family history isn't much use locked away." Michael reopened the album, turning to a page that showed Henry's grandfather standing proudly beside his first tractor, a primitive machine by modern standards, but revolutionary for its time. "Your grandfather came back from World War I and built all this," Michael observed. "Must have taken incredible determination." "And luck," Henry added, settling across from him. "He used to say that for every ounce of effort he put in, he received an equal measure of good fortune. Right place, right time, right people crossing his path when he needed them most." For a moment, Henry saw himself and Michael reflected in that history. Two men at crossroads, each facing challenges that seemed insurmountable, yet finding unexpected connection that somehow lightened their respective burdens. "The fence looks good," Henry said, changing the subject. "You've done this kind of work before." Michael nodded. Grew up on a ranch in Colorado. Small operation, mostly horses. Dad was military too, so we moved around some, but always came back to that land. Lost it after he died. Mum couldn't manage alone. The parallel to Henry's situation wasn't lost on either of them. Another piece of family land, another legacy disrupted. "How'd the bank meeting go?" Michael asked after a moment. Henry shook his head. "About as expected. No extensions, no alternatives except selling part of the land or bringing in outside investors." "Would that be so bad?" Michael asked carefully. "Keeping some of it at least?" Henry struggled to articulate why the compromise felt so untenable. This land, it's not just acres and boundaries. It's a whole. Each field, each building, each tree my grandfather or father planted, they're all connected. Parts of a story that's been unfolding for nearly a century. He gestured toward the album Michael had been examining. Splitting it up would be like tearing pages from a book. You might save some of the story, but you lose the meaning. Michael considered this, his expression reflective. In the Rangers, they taught us that adapting to changing circumstances isn't the same as surrendering. Sometimes holding your position gets you killed. Sometimes a tactical retreat is what allows you to ultimately complete the mission. The military analogy struck Henry with unexpected force. Perhaps his insistence on preserving the farm exactly as it had been was its own form of inflexibility, a refusal to adapt that might ultimately cost him everything rather than just parts. "Something to think about," Henry acknowledged. Not quite. Ready to embrace the perspective, but recognizing its wisdom nonetheless. The evening passed comfortably, with Henry and Michael sharing a simple meal, and more conversations that ranged from farming techniques to Michael's military experiences to the changes both men had witnessed in rural America over their lifetimes. There was something therapeutic in speaking openly about challenges and losses with someone who understood struggle intimately, yet maintained an underlying resilience. Before turning in for the night, they sat on the porch watching heat lightning flicker on the distant horizon, a tantalizing hint of atmospheric activity that would likely bring no relief from the drought, but provided a beautiful spectacle nonetheless. "You know," Michael said thoughtfully, "one thing I learned during my worst days on the road is that rock bottom has a strange gift to it." Henry raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the unexpected observation. "When you've lost almost everything," Michael continued, "you discover what's truly essential. And sometimes that clarity is exactly what you need to build something new." As they watched the silent lightning dance across the sky, Henry pondered these words, finding in them an unexpected comfort. Whatever came next, whether the farm was saved through some unforeseen miracle or lost despite his best efforts, he would face it with the clarity that comes from being stripped to essentials. And perhaps in that clarity he might discover new purpose, new meaning, new ways to honor the legacy his family had built on this land. The lightning continued its distant display, neither promising rain nor entirely withholding hope. Much like life itself, Henry reflected, with its persistent uncertainty and occasional moments of unexpected beauty amid the harshest conditions. Henry woke before dawn, his internal clock unaffected by the previous day's emotional upheaval. For a moment, as consciousness returned, he wondered if he'd dreamed the encounter in the barn, but the sound of someone moving quietly in the kitchen confirmed Michael's presence. Pulling on his work clothes, Henry made his way downstairs to find his guest standing uncertainly by the stove, Thought I might get coffee started, Michael explained, but didn't want to overstep. You found the coffee, that's a start, Henry replied, moving to the ancient percolator that had been Sarah's pride and joy. Not much for fancy brewing methods here. As Henry prepared breakfast, eggs from his hens, the last of yesterday's, bread toasted, he observed Michael surreptitiously. In the morning light, the veteran looked somewhat better than he had the previous evening. A night of proper rest in a real bed had eased some of the tension from his face, though the haunted look in his eyes remained. Got some work to do in the vegetable patch, Henry said as they ate. You're welcome to rest up here if you want. Michael set down his coffee mug. Rather help, if that's all right. Been a while since I've had dirt under my fingernails on purpose. Henry nodded, pleased but not surprised. Something about Michael suggested he wasn't a man accustomed to idleness despite his circumstances. The August sun rose quickly, bringing with it the now familiar oppressive heat. By 8 a.m., the temperature had already climbed into the high 80s, promising another day of drought and desperation for farmers across the county. Henry and Michael worked steadily in the vegetable garden, harvesting the ripe tomatoes, melons, and cucumbers that had survived through Henry's careful rationing of well water. Despite his injured leg, Michael proved to be a capable worker, methodical and thorough. He moved more slowly than a younger, uninjured man might have, but what he lacked in speed, he made up for in precision. Not a single tomato was bruised under his careful handling. "You've done this before," Henry observed as they took a water break in the shade of the old oak tree beside the house. Michael nodded. "My grandmother had a victory garden she kept going long after the war ended. Spent summers with her as a kid, learning how to grow things." A shadow crossed his face. "Always thought I might have a garden of my own someday, before." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Before the war, before the injuries, before life took an unexpected and brutal turn. "Not too late for that," Henry said simply. Midday, they had harvested everything that was ready, a modest collection that filled 3 wooden crates. It wasn't the bounty Henry would have hoped for in a normal season, but given the relentless drought, it represented a minor miracle of agricultural persistence. "Normally, I'd set these out at my roadside stand," Henry explained as they carried the crates to his pickup truck. "But with the bank deadline coming, thought I'd try the farmers' markets in some of the nearby towns. Cottonwood has one on Tuesdays, Riverside on Wednesdays, and Oakdale on Thursdays. Might get better prices that way." "Mind if I come along?" Michael asked. "Been a long time since I've seen a proper small-town farmers' market." They loaded the truck together, carefully arranging the produce to prevent damage during the drive. Scout, who had appointed himself Michael's shadow, jumped into the truck bed, clearly assuming he was part of the expedition. The Cottonwood Farmers Market was held in the town square, a modest affair with perhaps 24 vendors, selling everything from produce and honey to handmade quilts and woodcrafts. Henry found a spot between a honey seller and a woman offering homemade preserves. To Henry's surprise, Michael proved to be an unexpected asset at the market. While Henry tended to be reserved with customers, polite but not especially talkative, Michael engaged effortlessly with everyone who approached their stand. He had a natural talent for connecting with people, sharing just enough of his story to create a bond without making anyone uncomfortable. "These tomatoes have survived the worst drought in 30 years, he would tell customers, grown by a 3rd-generation farmer whose grandfather started this farm after serving in World War I. You're not just buying food, You're supporting a piece of American history." By mid-afternoon, they had sold nearly everything they'd brought. The proceeds weren't spectacular. Drought had tightened everyone's budgets, but they were better than Henry had expected. "You missed your calling," Henry told Michael as they packed up the empty crates. "Should have been in sales." Michael smiled slightly. "Just telling the truth. People connect with stories, not just products. Your farm has a story worth sharing." As they drove back to the farm, Henry found himself sharing more of that story, how his grandfather had started with just 40 acres and gradually expanded, how his father had modernized during the prosperous years after World War II, how Henry himself had navigated the farm crisis of the 1980s by diversifying into specialty vegetables. "Sounds like adapting is in your family's DNA," Michael observed. "Had to be," Henry replied. "Farming's always changing. Weather, markets, technology. Stand still and you get left behind." Upon returning to the farm, they found an unexpected visitor waiting for them. Richard, Margaret's husband, his sedan parked beside the house. "Sorry to drop by unannounced," Richard said as they pulled up. "Margaret's worried about you." Henry made introductions, explaining Michael's presence with deliberate casualness. Richard, a Vietnam veteran himself, immediately extended his hand to Michael. "Army?" he asked, recognizing a fellow service member with the intuition of shared experience. "Rangers," Michael confirmed. "You?" "Marines, 68 to 70. That simple exchange established an immediate understanding between the two men. Henry watched as decades of difference in age and experience were bridged by the unspoken brotherhood of those who had served. Over coffee at the kitchen table, Richard shared the real reason for his visit. "Margaret told me about the bank's deadline. I've been making some calls, Henry. There's a veterans assistance program that might be able to help with emergency loans for farmers with military connections." Henry frowned. "I didn't serve, Richard, you know that." "But your son did," Richard pointed out, "and your father, and your grandfather. There are family service provisions in some of these programs." Michael, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "If it helps, I could explain the situation at the VA office in Wichita. I need to check on my own paperwork anyway, see if they've sorted out the issues with my benefits." Henry was about to refuse, his pride rebelling at the thought of seeking assistance, when he caught sight of the family photograph on the wall. His grandfather, who had survived the trenches of France only to face the hardships of establishing a farm during difficult economic times, had not been too proud to accept help when it was offered. The farm's very existence was testament to that. "Worth looking into, I suppose," Henry conceded. Richard smiled slightly, recognizing the concession for the significant shift it represented. "I'll call my contact at the Veterans Center tomorrow to set things up." After Richard left, promising to return the following day to drive them to Wichita, Henry and Michael spent the evening preparing for the next day's farmers' market in Riverside. The work, washing and sorting the remaining produce, repairing one of the wooden crates that had split, provided a comfortable rhythm, the kind of purposeful activity that required just enough attention to keep darker thoughts at bay. "Why'd you stop in my barn?" Henry asked suddenly, the question that had been lingering in his mind finally finding voice. "Plenty of abandoned buildings around these parts. Why mine?" Michael's hands stilled on the tomato he was polishing. "Honest answer," Henry nodded. "Saw the flag," Michael said simply. "American flag by your mailbox, properly displayed. properly lit at night. Military families tend to get those details right. Figured if I had to risk trespassing, I'd rather deal with someone who respected the flag than someone who didn't. The observation struck Henry with unexpected force. The flag had been a constant presence at the farm entrance for as long as he could remember. His father, a World War II veteran, had been fastidious about its proper display, a tradition Henry had maintained without much conscious thought. That this simple act of patriotism had influenced Michael's decision seemed both surprising and entirely fitting. As night fell, with the day's work complete, they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge. Scout lay between them, his head resting contentedly on Michael's foot. The evening breeze, slightly cooler than it had been in weeks, brought with it the scent of distant fields and the faint promise of eventual relief from the relentless heat. "What will you do?" Michael asked quietly, "if the bank doesn't extend the deadline?" It was the question Henry had been avoiding, even in the privacy of his own thoughts. "Don't rightly know," he admitted. "Margaret and Richard have offered. There's spare room until I figure something out. Could sell some of the equipment, maybe, enough to get a small place in town." The prospect felt hollow as he spoke it aloud. Henry had never lived anywhere but this farm. The thought of existing within the confines of a town lot, without the expanse of fields surrounding him, without the connection to the land his family had worked for generations, seemed less like living and more like a kind of half-existence. "Never thought it would end this way," Henry continued, the darkness making it easier to voice his fears. "Always figured I'd pass it on to Thomas eventually, even though he chose the military. Or maybe to one of Margaret's grandkids, if they showed interest. The idea of being the one who loses it." His voice trailed off. "My grandfather used to say that as long as you're still breathing, the story isn't over," Michael said after a moment of silence. "Sounds like the kind of thing people say to make themselves feel better, I know, but I've seen it be true more times than not." Henry considered this, finding unexpected comfort in the simple wisdom. "Your grandfather sounds like he was a wise man." "Career military," Michael explained. 4 wars, from World War II through Vietnam. Saw the worst humanity had to offer and somehow kept his faith in people. Used to tell me that hope isn't about expecting things to work out the way you want. It's about believing that whatever happens, you'll find the strength to face it. They sat in companionable silence for a while longer, each man lost in his own thoughts, bound by a connection that had formed with surprising speed, yet felt as natural as the land beneath their feet. The next morning, Richard arrived as promised to drive them to Wichita. The city, though modest by national standards, felt jarringly urban after the isolated peace of the farm. The VA office was located in a sprawling complex of government buildings, its waiting room crowded with veterans of various ages and conflicts, all navigating the often bewildering bureaucracy that determined their access to benefits they had earned through service. Henry felt distinctly out of place, a civilian among warriors, but Michael moved through the space with the ease of familiarity, nodding to several veterans he seemed to recognize from previous visits. Richard, too, exchanged greetings with some of the older men, the shared language of military service evident in their brief interactions. Their appointment was with a benefits counselor named Patricia Martinez, a brisk, efficient woman whose desk was piled high with file folders and whose computer screen displayed a daunting array of government forms. "So, Mr. Wilson," she began. After introductions were complete, Richard has explained your situation. While the program he mentioned doesn't precisely fit your circumstances, there might be alternatives we could explore. For the next hour, Patricia guided them through a labyrinth of potential assistance programs, some specifically for farmers, others for families with military connections, still others designed to preserve rural heritage properties. Henry's head swam with acronyms and eligibility requirements, application deadlines, and documentation needs. The challenge, Patricia explained, is that most of these programs have processing times measured in months, not weeks, with your bank deadline so close. Michael, who had been listening intently, leaned forward. What about emergency hardship provisions? I know the VA has protocols for veterans facing imminent homelessness or medical crises. Patricia turned her attention to Michael, her expression softening slightly. Are you currently receiving your full benefits, Sergeant Reeves? The question seemed to surprise Michael. No, ma'am. There's been some issue with my paperwork for the past 3 years. That's partly why I'm here today. Patricia's fingers flew across her keyboard. Let me check your status in the system. What followed was an educational glimpse into the frustrating complexity of the Veterans Benefits System. According to Patricia, Michael's benefits had been suspended due to a clerical error. His file had been mistakenly merged with that of another Michael Reeves, who had been reported deceased. You've been classified as deceased in our system for 3 years, Patricia said, her voice reflecting professional outrage. No wonder your benefits stopped. You've essentially been a ghost in the system. Explains a lot, Michael said with remarkable equanimity. No one at the Denver office could figure out why my claims kept getting rejected. Patricia continued to type, her expression growing increasingly determined. This is exactly the kind of administrative failure that the new Veterans Rapid Resolution Initiative was created to address. Let me make a call. While Patricia stepped away to use another phone, Henry found himself overwhelmed by the revelation. For 3 years, Michael had been struggling to survive, homeless, walking across states in search of work, sleeping in barns, all because of a bureaucratic error that had declared him dead when he was very much alive. How are you not furious? Henry asked quietly. Michael shrugged. Been angry plenty of times, doesn't change anything. Right now, someone's trying to fix it. That's what matters. When Patricia returned, her expression had transformed from professional concern to something approaching triumph. I've spoken with the regional director, she announced. We're implementing emergency protocols to restore your benefits immediately, Sergeant Reeves. You should have access to your back payments, 3 years' worth, within 72 hours. The news struck Michael like a physical blow. He sat very still, his expression unreadable. All of it? He finally managed. All of it, Patricia confirmed. Plus interest, and your ongoing monthly benefits will resume without interruption. She handed him a business card. The director would like you to call him personally to ensure everything is processed correctly. That's... Michael seemed at a loss for words. Thank you. That's going to change everything. As it should, Patricia said firmly. Now, as for your situation, Mr. Wilson, let me show you a different approach we might take. They spent another hour discussing options, with Patricia identifying a rural heritage preservation grant that might be applicable to Wilson Farm given its long history and connection to a multi-generational military family. The application process was complex, but potentially promising, if Henry could secure a temporary extension from the bank. The key is getting the bank to agree to wait for the grant decision, Patricia explained. These typically process within 60 to 90 days, which is considerably faster than most government programs, but still longer than your current deadline. By the time they left the VA office, the afternoon was well advanced. Richard suggested they stop for a late lunch before heading back to the farm, and they found themselves at a small family restaurant not far from the government complex. As they ate, Henry noticed a change in Michael, a subtle shift in his posture, a new light in his eyes. The crushing burden of financial insecurity had been lifted, and with it, some of the weariness that had seemed an intrinsic part of him. "What will you do?" Henry asked, "now that your benefits are being restored?" Michael considered the question carefully. "First, get properly back on my feet, find housing, get my health issues properly addressed." He paused. "But after that, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about it not being too late for that garden." The conversation flowed easily after that, turning to practical matters of gardening and farming, the challenges of rural life, the satisfaction of working with one's hands. Richard shared stories from his time as a school administrator before retirement, tales of students who had gone on to military service or returned to family farms. Michael spoke of his time in Afghanistan, not the combat or the horror, but the people he had met, the farmers who had managed to coax crops from seemingly impossible terrain. It was nearly evening by the time they returned to Wilson Farm. As Richard's car pulled into the long driveway, Henry was struck by the golden light of the setting sun illuminating his fields, transforming even the drought-stressed corn into something momentarily beautiful. Whatever happened with the bank, with the grant application, with his uncertain future, this land would endure. Whether it remained in Wilson hands or not, the earth itself would continue its ancient cycles of dormancy and renewal. "I should head back," Richard said after they had unloaded a few supplies they'd picked up in the city. "Margaret will be wondering what happened to us." As Richard prepared to leave, he pulled Henry aside. "I know you're worried about the farm, Henry, but today made me think sometimes the things we fear losing aren't really what's most important. Seeing how that young man's life changed in an instant because someone finally paid attention to his situation, it reminds me that people matter more than property." Henry nodded, recognizing the truth in his brother-in-law's words. "Thanks for today, Richard, for everything." After Richard's departure, Henry and Michael settled into what had already become a comfortable evening routine. A simple dinner, dishes washed and dried while discussing the day's events, Scout hovering hopefully for scraps. "Think I'll head out tomorrow," Michael said as they sat on the porch afterward, the evening cooler than it had been in weeks, with clouds finally gathering on the distant horizon. "Now that the benefits issue is resolved, I should start getting things properly sorted out." Though Henry had known their arrangement was temporary, he felt an unexpected pang at the announcement. In just a few days, Michael's presence had become a welcome counterpoint to the solitude that had defined his life since Sarah's passing. "You're welcome to stay longer if you want," Henry offered, "at least until you get your first payment and can find proper accommodations." Michael shook his head. "Got a call to make tomorrow morning. Need to be in Wichita for it. But thank you for everything. You took in a stranger when most people would have called the sheriff." "Did what anyone would do," Henry replied automatically. "No," Michael said with gentle firmness. "You didn't. What you did opening your home, sharing what little you had left, treating me with dignity when I had nothing to offer in return. That's rare, rarer than you might think." The sincerity in Michael's voice made Henry uncomfortable with its praise, but touched something deep within him nonetheless. For all the uncertainty surrounding the farm, for all the fear of losing his family's legacy, he had at least remained true to the values that had always defined the Wilson name. "The VA director I'm meeting," Michael continued after a moment. "He mentioned something interesting, said they've been expanding a program that places homeless veterans with rural host families, particularly farms. Helps the veterans transition back to civilian life while providing farmers with assistance. Some kind of therapeutic benefit to agricultural work, apparently." "Makes sense," Henry acknowledged. "Working the land has a way of putting things in perspective. Doesn't solve problems necessarily, but makes them seem more manageable somehow." They sat in companionable silence for a while longer, watching the stars emerge in the patches of clear sky between gathering clouds. The air felt different tonight, heavier, charged with potential. After months of drought, Henry's farmer's instinct told him rain might finally be coming. "Whatever happens with the bank," Michael said eventually, "I want you to know that these few days here, being treated like a person again, not just a problem to be solved or a burden to be carried, it's meant more than I can say." Henry, unused to such emotional directness, simply nodded. But as they turned in for what might be their last night of shared company, he found himself reflecting on the unexpected gift of this brief connection. In trying to help another, he had received something precious in return, a reminder that, even in the darkest moments, human dignity and simple kindness retain their power to transform lives. Outside, the first distant rumble of thunder sounded over the parched fields, a promise of renewal that felt, to Henry's hopeful heart, like an omen of possibilities yet to unfold. Henry woke to the gentle patter of rain against his bedroom window. Sound so longed for, so prayed for during the relentless drought, that for a moment he thought he must be dreaming. But as consciousness fully returned, the blessed reality confirmed itself. Rain had come at last, too late to save his crops or change the bank's decision, but a mercy nonetheless. Moving to the window, Henry watched the steady downpour transforming his parched land. The dusty ground darkened as it absorbed the moisture, and already he could imagine the dormant seeds below stirring with new possibility. Nature's cycle of renewal continued regardless of human concerns like mortgages and foreclosures. Downstairs, he found Michael already awake, standing on the covered porch with a steaming mug of coffee, transfixed by the rainfall. "Haven't seen rain like this in months," Henry commented, joining him. Michael nodded. "In Afghanistan, I once saw rain end a drought that had lasted 3 years. The local farmer said God had finally remembered them. Within weeks, fields that looked dead were green again." They watched the rainfall together for a while, the shared silence comfortable between them. Scout ventured out briefly into the yard, shook himself vigorously after getting soaked, then retreated to the porch to observe the weather more prudently from shelter. "I should get going," Michael said eventually. "The VA director is expecting me at 11. Richard said he could pick me up at the end of the driveway, if I can walk that far." "I'll drive you," Henry offered immediately. "No sense getting soaked. Besides, I need supplies from town." As they prepared to leave, Henry, noticed Michael packing his meager belongings carefully, making sure everything was exactly as he had found it in the guest room. The small gesture of respect touched Henry deeply. This was a man who, despite his circumstances, maintained his dignity and consideration for others. The drive to Wichita was contemplative, the countryside transformed by the steady rain. Creeks, that had been dry beds for months now, carried modest currents, and the fields they passed seemed to have shed some of their discouraged demeanor, standing a little straighter in the life-giving moisture. "It's not going to save my farm," Henry acknowledged, breaking a lengthy silence, "but it's good to see the land getting what it needs." Michael nodded, understanding Henry's bittersweet observation. "Sometimes we have to find satisfaction in the good things that happen, even when they're not the ones we most need." In Wichita, Henry dropped Michael at the VA office with a handshake that conveyed more than words could have: respect, gratitude, and a genuine hope for his future well-being. They had exchanged phone numbers, promised to stay in touch, but both men knew how easily such connections could fade amid life's demands and challenges. While Michael attended his meeting, Henry completed his errands: banking, groceries, a stop at the farm supply store for fencing materials he knew he likely wouldn't get to use. Each transaction felt heavy with finality, as if he were closing accounts rather than maintaining them. The bank clerk's sympathetic expression told Henry that news of his impending foreclosure had spread even to Wichita. By mutual agreement, they were to meet at a small diner near the VA office at 1 o'clock. Henry arrived early, settled at a booth by the window, and ordered coffee while he waited. The rain continued steadily, transforming the city streets into reflective surfaces that mirrored the grey sky above. At precisely 1 o'clock, the diner's door opened, and Henry looked up, expecting to see Michael. Instead, a tall, distinguished man in a crisp military uniform entered, his bearing unmistakably that of career military. His uniform bore the insignia of a 4-star general, and even in the casual setting of the small diner, his presence commanded attention. The general paused, surveying the room with practiced efficiency, then approached Henry's table with purpose. "Mr. Wilson?" he asked, his voice deep and resonant. Henry stood, automatically straightening his posture in response to the officer's presence. "Yes, sir." "General Robert Reeves, United States Army." The man introduced himself, extending his hand. "I understand you've been hosting my son, Michael." The revelation struck Henry with stunning force. Michael's father was a 4-star general. The homeless veteran who had been sleeping in his barn was the son of one of the highest-ranking officers in the military. "Please sit down," General Reeves continued, gesturing to the booth. "Michael is completing some paperwork. He'll join us shortly. I wanted a chance to speak with you privately first." Still processing this unexpected development, Henry resumed his seat. The waitress approached, clearly impressed by the general's uniform, and took his order for coffee with an unusual degree of attentiveness. "My son told me what you did for him," General Reeves began once the waitress had departed. "Taking him, in feeding him, treating him with dignity when he was at his lowest point. I want to thank you for that. Not many people would show such kindness to a stranger." "Did what anyone would do," Henry replied automatically, though he was beginning to recognize that perhaps this standard response wasn't entirely accurate. The general smiled slightly. "My son said you'd say exactly that, but we both know it's not true. What's true is that my son, a decorated combat veteran who served his country with honor, was sleeping in barns and under bridges because a bureaucratic error declared him dead, and most people chose not to see him at all, let alone help him. Henry wasn't sure how to respond to this frank assessment. Michael seems like a good man who had some bad luck. He is a good man, the general agreed. One who inherited his mother's stubbornness. When his benefits were cut off, he refused to contact me, said he needed to solve his own problems. By the time I discovered what had happened, he had already disappeared, his phone disconnected, his apartment vacated. I've had people looking for him for over 2 years. The general's composed exterior briefly cracked, revealing the worried father beneath the military bearing. When I got the call yesterday that he had been found, that his benefits were being reinstated because someone had finally noticed he wasn't actually dead, it was like getting my son back from the grave. Henry absorbed this information, understanding now why Michael had never mentioned his father, why he had been making his way east on foot rather than seeking help from his clearly well-connected family. He's very independent, Henry observed, proud in a good way. Like his old man, General Reeves acknowledged with a small smile. And like someone else I'm just getting to know, a certain Kansas farmer who refuses to accept help from his family, even when his farm is facing foreclosure. The unexpected parallel made Henry shift uncomfortably in his seat. Before he could formulate a response, the diner door opened again, and Michael entered, stopping short when he saw his father sitting with Henry. The reunion between father and son was a study in restrained emotion, a firm handshake that evolved into a brief but powerful embrace, a few words exchanged too quietly for Henry to hear, nods of understanding that spoke volumes about their complicated relationship. Henry felt simultaneously privileged to witness this moment and uncomfortably like an intruder on a deeply private scene. When they joined him at the table, Michael's expression was complex. Relief, embarrassment, and a hint of defiance all mingled together. "I see you've met my father," he said to Henry. "Just getting acquainted," Henry confirmed, trying to set Michael at ease. "He's been telling me how proud he is of your service." The tension in Michael's shoulders eased slightly. "The VA director called him yesterday after our meeting. I didn't know he was coming. When I hear my son is alive, after thinking he might be dead for 2 years, wild horses couldn't keep me away," General Reeves said simply. The conversation that followed was remarkable for its ordinariness given the extraordinary circumstances. 3 men sharing a meal, discussing weather and farming and military life, with the easy rhythm of those who have discovered unexpected common ground. The general was clearly military through and through, but beneath his authoritative demeanor, Henry sensed a genuinely good man, trying to reconnect with a son whose path had diverged dramatically from his expectations. As they finished their meal, General Reeves turned to Henry with unexpected directness. "Michael tells me you're about to lose your farm. 3rd-generation family land, facing foreclosure at the end of the month." Henry stiffened slightly. He had shared that information with Michael as one man facing hardship to another, not expecting it to become a topic of discussion with a stranger, even one as distinguished as the general. "That's correct," he acknowledged, his tone reserved. "He also mentioned that you're a skilled farmer with a proven track record of innovation during difficult conditions, that your soil has unique properties, particularly suitable for drought-resistant crops, and that you have 3 generations of meticulous agricultural records documenting farming conditions in your region." Henry glanced at Michael, surprised by how much attention he had paid to their conversations about the farm's history and how accurately he had assessed its potential value. The Army has been expanding its agricultural resilience program, General Reeves continued. It's designed to study sustainable farming practices that could be implemented in regions affected by conflict and climate change. We've been looking for partner farms with exactly your kind of historical data and expertise. Henry listened with increasing interest as the General outlined a program that seemed almost too perfectly aligned with his situation to be real. A research partnership that would provide funding for sustainable farming innovations while preserving the historical integrity of legacy farms. "Why are you telling me this?" Henry asked finally, when the General had finished his explanation. "Because I'd like to offer you a proposition," General Reeves replied. "The program needs demonstration farms, places where we can implement and test these agricultural approaches in real-world conditions, places with established histories that can show the before and after effects of these methods. Wilson Farm would be an ideal candidate." The General laid out the details, a 10-year research partnership that would provide stable funding while leaving ownership and management of the farm in Henry's hands. The Army would gain valuable data on sustainable farming practices. Henry would receive the financial support necessary to modernize his operation while preserving its historical significance. "This isn't charity," the General emphasized clearly, recognizing Henry's instinctive resistance to anything that might feel like a handout. "This is a mutually beneficial arrangement between the United States military and a civilian partner with unique expertise and resources. We've established similar partnerships with half a dozen farms across the country already." As Henry considered the proposal, he found himself searching for the catch, the hidden condition that would reveal this apparent miracle as too good to be true. "Why now?" he asked finally. "Why me? Is this because of Michael?" The General exchanged a glance with his son. "I won't insult your intelligence, Mr. Wilson. Would I be sitting in this diner in Wichita if Michael hadn't been found on your farm? Probably not. But that doesn't change the fact that your farm meets every criterion our program has established for potential partners. This isn't favoritism. It's recognizing an opportunity that benefits everyone involved." Michael, who had been mostly silent during this exchange, finally spoke up. "When the VA director asked me about my plans now that my benefits were being reinstated, I mentioned your farm situation. He was the one who made the connection to Dad's program, said it sounded like a perfect match." Henry sat back, overwhelmed by the unexpected turn of events. 3 days ago, he had been a desperate man facing the loss of his family legacy, with no option but surrender to the inevitable. Now, through a chain of events that began with his simple decision to offer shelter to a stranger, a path to salvation had appeared that he couldn't have imagined. "I'd need time to think about it," he said finally, "to review the details." "Of course," General Reeves agreed immediately. "I've taken the liberty of preparing some preliminary documents for your review, and I've contacted First Kansas Bank to inform them of the potential partnership. They've agreed to extend your deadline by 30 days to allow time for proper consideration and paperwork." The rain had stopped by the time they left the diner, leaving behind a freshly washed world and the earthy scent that follows a drought-breaking rainfall. Henry's mind was still processing the extraordinary proposal as they walked to his truck. the papers outlining the potential partnership safely stored in a waterproof portfolio the general had provided. "I'll be staying in Wichita for a few days," General Reeves told Henry as they prepared to part ways. "Michael will be joining me while we sort out his housing and medical care, but I hope you'll call once you've reviewed the proposal. Whether you decide to accept or decline, I'd value the opportunity to discuss it further." As Henry drove back to the farm alone, the countryside seemed transformed, not just by the rainfall, but by the radical shift in his prospects. The same fields he had passed that morning with a sense of impending loss now held the potential for renewed purpose. The farm that had been slipping through his fingers might yet remain in Wilson hands, continuing a legacy he had thought was ending with him. By the time Henry reached the farm, the rain had cleared entirely, leaving behind a double rainbow arching across the eastern sky, a sight so perfectly aligned with his changed circumstances that he had to laugh at the cosmic poetry of it. Scout greeted him with enthusiastic relief, having clearly worried that his master might not return. The house felt strangely empty without Michael's presence. In just a few days, Henry had grown accustomed to the companionship, to having another person sharing the rhythms of farm life. But tonight, the solitude served a purpose, giving him space to reflect on the extraordinary proposition he had been offered. At the kitchen table, Henry spread out the documents General Reeves had provided, reading through them with careful attention. The proposal was detailed, comprehensive, and remarkably fair, preserving his autonomy while providing the financial stability the farm desperately needed. There were conditions, certainly, primarily related to implementing and documenting the sustainable farming practices the program was designed to study, but nothing that compromised the essential character of Wilson Farm or its legacy. As night fell, Henry found himself gazing at the family photographs that lined the kitchen wall. His grandfather, standing proudly beside the first tractor, his father inspecting a bumper wheat crop in the 1950s, himself and Sarah on their wedding day with the farmhouse in the background. They had all faced challenges, all adapted to changing circumstances while remaining true to the land that had sustained them. The telephone's ring startled him from his reverie. It was Margaret, checking to make sure he had weathered the storm safely. "Richard told me about the meeting at the VA," she said after Henry had assured her all was well. "Said you met someone who might be able to help with the farm situation?" Henry hesitated, not yet ready to share the full details of General Reeves's proposal until he had made his decision. "There might be a possibility," he acknowledged. "I'm looking into it." "That's wonderful, Henry." Margaret's voice warmed with hope. "I've been so worried about you facing this alone." After they hung up, Henry returned to the documents, examining the partnership proposal from every angle, looking for hidden pitfalls or unacceptable compromises. But the more he studied it, the more convinced he became that this unexpected opportunity was not just a reprieve, but a chance to revitalize the farm in ways that honored its past while securing its future. By midnight, Henry had made his decision. He would call General Reeves in the morning to accept the partnership offer, but first there was something he needed to do, something that felt right, that completed the circle of events that had brought him to this moment. Henry turned to a fresh page in the family ledger, the book where generations of Wilsons had recorded not just harvests and plantings, but the significant moments that had shaped the farm's history. In careful handwriting, he documented the events of the past few days, The discovery of Michael in the barn, the unexpected connection to General Reeves, the proposal that would give Wilson Farm a new purpose while preserving its legacy. The end. He added a reflection that felt important to capture for future generations. Today, I was reminded that the true wealth of this land lies not just in what it produces, but in the values it has instilled in those who work it. My grandfather believed that the measure of a person was not their success, but how they responded to hardship, whether they faced it with integrity, with compassion for others, with faith in the future. In extending a hand to someone in need, I inadvertently opened a door to the farm's salvation. The Wilson family motto has always been, "We endure," and today I add to that, we endure because we remain true to who we are, even in our darkest moments. The next morning dawned clear and brilliant, the world renewed by the rainfall. Henry rose early, as always, but today his movements had a lightness that had been absent for months. After completing his morning chores, he called General Reeves to accept the partnership proposal, setting in motion the process that would transform Wilson Farm from a failing family operation to a research destination focused on agricultural innovation and sustainability. 3 days later, as Henry returned from a trip to the bank where he had signed the initial paperwork that would halt the foreclosure proceedings, he was met with an astonishing sight as he turned into his long driveway. A convoy of military vehicles was approaching from the opposite direction, led by a distinctive black SUV he recognized as belonging to General Reeves. But it wasn't just military vehicles. Behind them came a procession of tractors, combines, pickup trucks loaded with equipment, all driven by familiar faces. Neighbors, fellow farmers, members of the community he had thought too preoccupied with their own struggles to notice his. Henry parked his truck and stepped out, bewildered by the impromptu parade arriving at his farm. General Reeves emerged from the lead vehicle, followed by Michael, both grinning widely at Henry's obvious confusion. "What is all this?" Henry asked as they approached. "Phase 1 of the Agricultural Resilience Program," General Reeves explained. "Initial equipment deployment and community integration. Translation: Dad pulled some strings to get things moving quickly," Michael added with a smile. "And when word spread about the program and what it could mean for the region, your neighbors volunteered to help get the demonstration plots ready." From the second vehicle emerged a team of agricultural scientists and military personnel carrying tablets and equipment Henry didn't recognize. From the tractors and trucks came people he'd known his entire life. Jim Lawson from the neighboring farm, the Peterson brothers whose family had farmed 2 sections over since the 1930s, even old Frank Miller, who had retired from farming a decade ago but still served on the county agricultural board. "We heard about the Army program," Jim said as he approached, extending his hand. "Figured you might need some help getting those test plots laid out before planting season. Besides, we all wanted to see this fancy equipment they're bringing in." The demonstration plots would occupy 70 acres of Henry's land, implementing various sustainable farming techniques designed to maximize yield while minimizing water usage, a crucial consideration in drought-prone regions. The remaining acreage would continue under traditional management as a control group, allowing for direct comparison of methods. As the day progressed, the farm transformed from a solitary operation on the brink of failure to a hive of purposeful activity. Military personnel set up monitoring equipment in the fields. Scientists collected soil samples for baseline analysis, and local farmers operated equipment they had brought to help prepare the land. The atmosphere was one of collaborative energy, a sense of being part of something larger than individual success or failure. Late in the afternoon, as the work began to wind down, General Reeves found Henry watching the activity from the shade of the old oak tree beside the house. "Quite a change from a few days ago," the general observed, joining him in the shade. Henry nodded, still somewhat overwhelmed by the dramatic reversal in his circumstances. Never expected anything like this, kept thinking there had to be a catch somewhere. "Sometimes the universe balances its accounts in unexpected ways," General Reeves said. "Michael told me something interesting. Said when he asked why you helped him, you mentioned your grandfather being helped by a stranger after World War I, which allowed him to eventually buy this land." "That's right," Henry confirmed. "Never knew the man's name, just that he gave my grandfather a chance when no one else would." The general smiled slightly. "My grandfather served in the First World War. Came back to find his family farm in Virginia had been lost to back taxes while he was overseas. A Kansas farmer he met on the train west offered him work, helped him get back on his feet. That Kansas farmer's name was Thomas Wilson." The revelation hit Henry with stunning force. "Your grandfather knew my grandfather, more than knew him. According to family law, he credited Thomas Wilson with saving his life, not physically but spiritually. Said Thomas restored his faith in humanity at a time when the war had nearly destroyed it." The general looked out over the fields where his teams were working alongside local farmers. "When Michael told me about finding shelter on a Wilson farm in Kansas, I thought it might be coincidence. But once I looked into the history, well, some circles are meant to close, it seems." Henry stood in silence, absorbing this extraordinary connection spanning 3 generations. His grandfather's simple act of kindness toward a fellow veteran nearly a century ago had set in motion a chain of events that now, in Henry's moment of greatest need, had come full circle to save the very land that act had helped secure. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the revitalized farm, the workers gathered in the yard for a meal that had materialized through the combined efforts of military mess specialists and local farm wives. Tables had been set up under the trees, laden with hearty food designed to replenish energy after a day of physical labor. General Reeves raised his glass in a toast that brought a hush to the gathering. "To Wilson Farm and the Agricultural Resilience Program, may this partnership benefit not just those gathered here today, but farmers facing similar challenges around the world. And to Henry Wilson, whose simple act of kindness toward a stranger reminded all of us what it truly means to live by the values we claim to uphold." As the gathering continued into the evening, with conversations flowing easily between military personnel and local farmers, between scientists and community members, Henry found himself standing somewhat apart, observing the transformation that had occurred not just in his circumstances, but in his perspective. Michael approached, handing him a fresh glass of lemonade. "Penny for your thoughts." Henry smiled slightly. "Just thinking about chances taken, doors opened. A week ago, I was sure I'd be the one to lose this farm after 3 generations. Now." He gestured to the activity around them, the monitoring, equipment being installed, the people who had come together to launch this new chapter in the farm's history. "Now you're pioneering agricultural techniques that might help feed people in war-torn regions," Michael completed the thought. Full circle. As darkness fell, The crowd gradually dispersed, with promises to return the following day to continue the work of establishing the demonstration plots. The military personnel retreated to accommodations in town, the local farmers to their own homes, until only Henry, Michael, and General Reeves remained, sitting on the porch in the mild evening air. "I'll be heading back to Washington tomorrow," the general informed them. "The program will continue under the direction of Major Hernandez, who you met today. But I wanted to mention one additional aspect of the partnership we haven't discussed yet." Henry raised an eyebrow, wondering what other surprise might be forthcoming. "The Veterans Agricultural Training component," General Reeves explained. "One of the program's objectives is to provide transitioning service members with training in sustainable farming practices. We need placement sites, farms willing to host veterans for 6-month internships." Like the program Michael mentioned, Henry recalled, placing veterans with rural host families. "Exactly. I understand if it's too much to consider right now with everything else." "I'd like to do it," Henry interrupted, the decision forming as he spoke the words. "This house is too big for just one person, and I could use the help." The general nodded, clearly pleased but not surprised by Henry's response. "I thought you might say that. Michael has expressed interest in being the first participant, if that's amenable to you." Henry looked at Michael, seeing in his face the same quiet determination that had characterized his grandfather, the same resilience that had carried him through hardship without surrendering his essential dignity. "I'd be honored," he said simply. Later that night, after the general had departed for his hotel in town and Michael had settled into what was now officially his room rather than just temporary accommodation, Henry stood at his bedroom window, gazing out at his land. The moon illuminated the fields where generations of Wilsons had worked, suffered, persevered, and occasionally triumphed against the odds. In the distance, he could see the outline of the old barn where Scout had discovered Michael just days ago. A moment that now seemed preordained, a nexus point where past and future converged to create a new possibility neither man could have foreseen. Tomorrow would bring more work, more changes, more adaptation to new circumstances. But tonight, Henry allowed himself to simply experience gratitude for the rain that had finally come, for the legacy that would continue though in a form his ancestors couldn't have imagined, and most of all, for the reminder that even in our darkest moments, an act of simple human kindness can open doors we never knew existed. The farm that had been his burden now felt like his purpose again. The future that had seemed closed now stretched before him with renewed promise, and the solitude that had defined his existence since Sarah's passing had been replaced by a different kind of companionship, one based not on family obligation or romantic love, but on shared values, mutual respect, and the recognition that sometimes salvation comes in the form of being needed by others exactly when we most need them ourselves. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.